Greetings, Sunday School. It is a delight to be sharing with you another Sunday School preview. As we continue to look at the unit theme, dealing with problems in the church. So in this unit, we look at the topic, warnings against idolatry. And the first idea that you'll be looking at, which is the first part of the lesson, is ancient Israel's sinful example. Here you might have thought that the author of this commentary would have gone to an Old Testament text to look at this example. But rather, you will realize that it is in the New Testament that we get to look into this example of God's sinful people called Israel. So we will look at the text, 1 Corinthians 10, 1 to 6. So when you look at these few verses, you see where Paul begins to talk about the Israelite people, how all of them were baptized into Moses in the cloud, and he describes Jesus as the rock, and he said that all drank the same spiritual drink, a whole lot of good things. But in verse 5 you see somewhat of a negative being exposed. Paul said, but with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. So Paul highlights that they passed through the sea, that God delivered them, that God guided them with the cloud. But these people still did not submit to God the way they ought to. They rebelled against God. They were not faithful to God, and so as a result of their sinfulness, as a result of their disobedience and rebelliousness, many of them died. Many of them died because they did not please God. And Paul said that their bodies were scattered because they died. God killed them. And so that's an example that we today, the church, can look at, and you look more into that when you go to Sunday school. In the second part of the lesson, you will see an imperative, and this is reject sinful practices. And so the author of the commentary continues in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and Paul says, and do not become idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to play. Now this is a bit of a play on words, the idea of them rising up to play. It's simply a reference in the Old Testament to the people of God worshipping idols, just sinning against God. And so they were coming out of Egypt, a pagan nation. They were also surrounded by other pagan nations. They did not reject the false ideas and ideologies that were surrounding them, and they paid for that. So for us, as we think about this, there are many things around us. We were coming out of sin. We are coming out of sin. We are surrounded by idolatry. We are surrounded by people who worship self. We are surrounded by people who worship famous people, who worship houses and lands and money. And the word is saying to us, reject sinful practices, reject these idolatrous, sinful practices, even as we look back at the life of the Israelite people. The final idea is idolatry is demonic. Idolatry is demonic. And so as the lesson brings you down to verses 12 to 22 of the text, you will see where Paul Paul was telling these people to flee idolatry. Flee idolatry, he actually said. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. And he says, I speak to you as a wise, or as to wise men. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we, though many, are one bread and one body. And then later on, Paul was saying to them that the idolatrous practices, that were happening, they had demonic influences. So look at verse 20. He says, rather that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. Of course, I don't intend to go into the details of the text. You will do that. But you will recognize as you go through the lesson, and as you just think about these scriptures and the whole idea of idolatry, you will recognize that there are many things that become idols in our lives, or that can become idols in our lives. Anything that we begin to depend on for our satisfaction more than God. Anything that we begin to lean upon for our sustenance more than God. These things inevitably become idols, and they replace God in our lives. So enjoy the lesson. I will not give you any more. But one more thing. Please do not forget to make your way to the Old Harbor New Testament Church of God, where we will be having our National Sunday School Seminar. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers and persons who will be facilitating aspects or practical aspects of the seminar. So you don't want to miss that. The theme is A Century of Faith, the Sunday School, growing and going with the gospel. God bless you. See you all there.